All right, so Unit 12, Abnormal Psychology. So this is video 1, which is going to be an introduction to abnormal psychology, otherwise known as looking at psychological disorders. So 2 parts to the video. One, we're going to talk about defining the criteria to being labeled as abnormal or having a psychological disorder, which the 3 different areas they look at is if you're deviant, distressful, or you're showing a dysfunction. We'll also be talking about the history of the psychological disorders, looking at the medical model to current methods of diagnosing. So the problem is really defining what is abnormal, and it changes from culture to culture and place to place. So psychological disorder, it's a condition where one displays deviant thoughts, distressful emotions, and dysfunctional behaviors. And it's a pattern of thinking, feeling, and action that's outside the norm. The main cause of abnormal behavior in human beings is not individual abnormality, but rather the profound misfit between culture and our evolutionary heritage. And here's the big 3 things. If you're trying to diagnose an individual with a disorder, you really need to look at, do they display deviance, dysfunction, and distress? So the first one would be distress or discomfort. The behavior that an individual is displaying is upsetting or disturbing to the person who's displaying it. So this can be a characteristic as distress of endless worry, constantly nervous. It could also be something that's distressful as your emotional level is, let's say you're very angry. That's distressful to the person. The emotions are disturbing to the person that's displaying it. For each of the 3, distress, dysfunction, and deviant, I use the case of somebody having an eating disorder. So this would tie into distress if with an eating disorder is because you're constantly worrying about your diet, working out, gaining weight, etc. It's really taking over the majority of your time. Another behavior or another criteria is deviance, or what is known as bizarre thinking. The thinking that is different or extreme and it can't be understood by what is deemed normal people. So you're kind of nervous, you're anxious, you think maybe people are out to get you. An example of somebody with an eating disorder would be that the thought that you are overweight when in reality you're actually underweight. So these are a difference in thinking. And then dysfunction. Dysfunction is functioning that interferes with a person's ability to be constructive in society. So you can't perform your life roles because of this issue. So an example would be if you had an eating disorder, you stop coming to work or school or stop going out with friends because you're constantly worried what others would say or because of the anxiety of being around food. So again, 2 or 3 of these certain criteria that you're displaying would be red flags to an individual to have somebody analyze your behavior because it could lead to a psychological illness. Let's talk a little bit about the history of psychological disorders. So in ancient treatment, for hundreds and hundreds of years ago, psychological disorders included transplantation, exorcism, being caged like animals, beaten, burned, castricized, mutilated, and transfused with animals' blood. There was a historic time period where people who were deemed as having psychological disorders, they were not understood, and they experimented a lot with these individuals to try and find a cure for their illness. The medical model came about in the 18th century, and this is when they believed it was individuals had a disease. The medical model is a view that mental disorders are diseases of the mind, like an ordinary physical illness, and they have objective cause and require specific treatment. So the concept of the medical model is something physically could be wrong with you, and they need to diagnose, treat it, and then they could be cured. And what we understand today is that medical illness, psychological illnesses can't be cured as medical illnesses like cancer can be. Psychological disorders are similar to physical illnesses is what they believed. The medical model led to mental hospitals or asylums. In this supportive atmosphere, many patients actually improved, even thrived on rest and contemplation and simple but useful work. However, many were using experimental treatments, were overcrowded, spread with disease, and were in poor health standards by the late 1800s. They were very popular. However, many of them were showing a dramatic shift in treating people poorly. In the mid-1900s, alternative places were opening, rehabilitation centers were opening, and they slowly began to replace the need for asylums. Also, the spread of pharmaceutical drugs impacted the decline of asylums. And asylums are all closed today. There are mental health facilities in hospitals where many people who are diagnosed with a mental illness do go. So today, psychological disorders are believed to have a biological, psychological, and social cause. It's not just maybe potentially a biological problem, it's the impact of all three. It can be diagnosed based on their symptoms and treated or cured through therapy. And I'm going to put cured in italicized because most often they are not able to be cured. It often assumes that the biological, social, and psychological factors combined and interact together to produce these psychological disorders. And it might be helpful to include this chart in your notes, kind of looking at the three and how the three impact one to have a certain anxiety or have a certain depression disorder. So this is also another really good review. It looks at the biopsychosocial model and how it combines all of them, the biological, social, and psychological, to impact one's behavior. So I would pause this and I would jot it down because it's a really good review for you from Unit 1. So the biological includes biological, behavioral, genetic, and evolutionary perspectives. They state that chemistry and genes are the impact for the development of the psychological disorder. The biological believes that neurochemical or hormonal imbalance, genetic predispositions, and damage to the brain could be the cause of the disorder. Behavioral genetic really believes that it's the genetic impact being passed down from generations to generations. And evolutionary believes that a harmful evolutionary dysfunction that occurred when we evolved from psychological mechanisms do not perform their naturally selection function effectively, and it's passed down through people. The social takes into consideration behavioral approach, and I'm going to highlight here the sociocultural approach. If you remember this from Unit 1. Looking at the social perspective, the social impact states that behavioral learning and the environment are an impact in the development of psychological disorder. So behavior, the maladaptive responses learned through reinforcement of the wrong kinds of behaviors could impact a psychological disorder, or sociocultural, society and the environment impact development. Looking at impact here, I'm going to change this. And then psychological, the psychological perspective suggests that we must consider how people think about themselves and their relations with people could impact an individual. So the psychoanalytic approach believes that we have some sort of internal conflict, that unconsciousness is stemming from early trauma that caused us to have a psychological disorder. Humanistic believes that it is a result from the condition of society and how that can impact your thought process and reaching your goals. And the cognitive perspective believes it's our irrational and illogical perceptions of ourselves that could lead us to have a psychological disorder. So a combination of all of these is important, and this is a really good review from Unit 1.